On a time, therefore, Urin led them to the caves of the Rodothlum, and behold, the orcs had fled therefrom at the death of Glorund, and one only dwelt there still, an old misshapen dwarf who sat ever on the pile of gold, singing black songs of enchantment to himself. But none had come nigh till then to despoil him, for the terror of the drake lived longer than he, and none had ventured thither again for dread of the very spirit of Glorund, the worm. Now therefore, when those elves approached, the dwarf stood before the doors of the cave that was once the abode of Galwig, and he cried, "What will ye with me, O outlaws of the hills?" But Urin answered, "We come to take what is not thine." Then said the dwarf, and his name was Mim, "O Urin, little did I think to see thee, a lord of men, with such a rabble. Hearken now to the words of Mim the fatherless, and depart, touching not this gold no more than were it of venomous fires. For has not Glorund lain long years upon it, and the evil of the drakes of Melko is on it, and no good can it bring to man or elf, but I, only I, can ward it, Mim the dwarf, and by many a dark spell have I bound it to myself." Then Urin wavered, but his men were wroth at that, so that he bid them seize it all, and Mim stood by and watched, and he broke forth into terrible and evil curses. Thereat did Urin smite him, saying, "We came to take what was not thine. Now for thy evil words, we will take what is thine as well, even thy life." Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. That opening quote comes from the story of Turin and the Foaloke, the earliest version of the story of the children of Hurin, as presented in the second volume of the Lost Tales, compiled by Christopher Tolkien and published in 1984. In it, Urin, who will later be called Hurin, the father of Turin Turambar, goes to the caves of Rodothlum following the death of the dragon Glorund. There he discovers the dragon's hoard of gold, guarded by Mim the dwarf, who warns Urin off the treasure, only to be slain for his trouble, but not before he delivers ominous foreshadowing. Quote, "But Mim dying said unto Urin, Now elves and men shall rue this deed, and because of the death of Mim the dwarf shall death follow this gold so long as it remain on earth, and a like fate shall every part and portion share with the whole." And Urin shuddered, but his folk laughed. End quote. This is the first appearance of a dwarf in Professor Tolkien's writing, 20 years before The Hobbit, 35 years before The Lord of the Rings. Of all the many and varied creatures of Middle-earth, dwarves are among the most enigmatic. Not because we know nothing about them, but because what we do know only raises more questions. This week on the show, dwarves in Tolkien's legendarium. So let's pour some ale, sharpen our axes, and practice our accents. That's actually not the best place to start, but we might as well address it right up front, because the tradition of dwarves speaking with a thick Scottish accent isn't an easy one to pin down, at least not conclusively. A little research seems to suggest that it stems from a 1953 short story by American fantasy novelist Poul Anderson, which he then develops into a novel published in 1961. That novel, Three Hearts and Three Lions, is extremely influential over Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, the creators of Dungeons & Dragons, which in turn goes a long way to codifying all of these fantasy tropes for the next 50 years. I haven't read Three Hearts and Three Lions, though I am certainly going to, perhaps over on my genre fiction show Stars and Swords, but I am told that in that book there is a character named Hugi, a dwarf who is presented as speaking with that famous, pronounced Scottish accent. So this seems to filter directly into D&D, from there into the work of authors like Remedy Feist, for example, whose 1982 novel Magician features a very Scottish dwarf who leads our heroes through the Dollar General version of the Mines of Moria. From there, the idea kind of sticks in the popular imagination, up through Blizzard's early Warcraft games in the mid-1990s, through the strange and non-specific accent work of John Rhys-Davies in the Jackson movies, into the very influential World of Warcraft multiplayer video game. At least, that's one explanation. But what's interesting about dwarves is that even when they are voiced in other languages, they tend to occupy a similarly rustic, rugged, hale and hearty, often hard-drinking, hard-fighting, barely civilized kind of position, at least relevant to the dominant society of the setting. In German, for example, dwarves tend to speak with a Bavarian accent. In France, dwarves are from the south, leaning more on the Mediterranean culture and heritage. We seem, therefore, to be positioning dwarves spatially, geographically. And in the end, the trope takes on a life of its own. Now dwarves are Scottish, or Scottish adjacent by default. I guess Games Workshop and the Warhammer universe position dwarves as being from Yorkshire and the north of England, or at least the northeast of England. The Hobbit movies, of course, attribute to the dwarves regional accents from all across Britain. But none of this has any real connection to the work of Professor Tolkien, though he is often incorrectly credited, or blamed, for the phenomenon of the Scottish dwarf. Originally, as can be seen in the first version of the story of Mime the Petty Dwarf, he's largely importing dwarfs, stress the F, from Norse and Germanic myth, from which we draw the Old English word dweorg. The Old Norse prose Edda, which is a major inspiration for Tolkien, gives us terms like svartalfar and dokulfar, black elves and dark elves, which may be intended to be dwarves. We also get individual dwarves like Andvari and Fjalar and Galar. We get Brokor and Sindri, the brothers who craft Mjolnir, and more besides. Dwarves are smiths and craftspersons. They live within vast hollow mountains and subterranean halls. They are usually, though not always, described as being shorter than human beings. In earlier stories, we get only male characters, almost always bearded, though even then, in some cases, they appear beardless, ominously like human children. They seem to originate in the earliest tales as bodiless spirits, mischievous and tricky, and they're often associated explicitly with light or darkness. They are, in general, a kind of minor supernatural being given to treasure and trickery, not completely distinct from gnomes and fairies. This is the tradition that Tolkien is drawing from. Mime, the first dwarf, is a willing servant of the terrible dragon Glorund. Later in that story, the orcs and the dwarves together will attack Artenor, the original name for Doriath in Beleriand, and destroy it, slaying many, including King Tenwillant, who will later be renamed Thingol. The dwarves are firmly on the side of the bad guys, associated with dark magic and curses and enchantment, though they are, perhaps, less evil by nature than the orcs are. They are, even at this point in the development of Tolkien's legendarium, given the plural noun dwarves with a V. In fact, I can't think of a single instance in Tolkien's writing when he uses dwarfs with an F, which was, and is still today, the standard English plural for dwarf, though the formal plural, as Tolkien notes later in his career, is dwarrows. Thorin is a dwarrow. His company consists of 13 dwarrows and 1 hobbit, and, I guess, an occasional wizard. That word persists in Tolkien's writing only in one of the alternate names for Khazad-dûm, the Dwarrow-delf, literally dwarf delving. In any case, Tolkien acknowledged that dwarves with a V is bad grammar, but used it anyway, mirroring his preference for elves with a V. That original perspective on the dwarves, however, doesn't last. Tolkien revises his stories basically constantly. By the 1930 draft of the Quenta Silmarillion, the dwarves are already a touch more sympathetic. They're no longer allied with the dragon, but rather driven by their desire for the works of their own hands, which is a major theme even at that point in the development of the Silmarillion. As Christopher Tolkien notes in The Shaping of Middle-earth, Tolkien says of the dwarves during this phase that, quote, "They do not serve Morgoth, but they are in many things more like his people," end quote. So, an improvement, but a small one. By the late 1930s, Professor Tolkien is actively working on Khazad-dûm, the secret dwarven language, and he's considering the larger question of where these mysterious dwarves come from. In the version of the story called the Llamas, included in The Lost Road and other writings, he attributes for the first time the creation of the dwarves to the Valar Aule. It isn't fully developed, but that is the origin story that will stick. And of course, Tolkien has a good reason for revising his original concept for the dwarves of Middle-earth at that time, because in 1930 he begins writing The Hobbit, originally a fairy tale adventure for children, which becomes integrated degree by degree into the web of stories he's already been thinking about for 15 years. In The Hobbit, he draws most of the names for the dwarven company directly from the Dvertgatal, a part of the Voluspa, the prophecy of the seeress, a part of that poetic Edda. Dwalin and Bifur and Bofur and Bombur, Nori and Dori and Ori, Fili and Kili, Glowin and Owen, and Thorin. Also appearing on that list, interestingly, are the names Gandalf and the name Eikenskjaldi, which means Oakenshield. Balin, it turns out, is the only dwarf not named in the Dvergatal. It is possible that the name comes from the Old Norse word for fire, or he's named after Sir Balin from Mallory's Mort d'Arthur. Or he's called Balin just because it rhymes with Dwalin. The dwarves, as we meet them in The Hobbit, are, as Beorn will describe them later in the book, a fine comic troupe. Much has been made of their musical instruments and their chip the glasses and crack the plates song, and their general lack of preparation and capability and armament, at least through the first half of the book. We are told that dwarves don't like elves. Quote, Even decent enough dwarves like Thorin and his friends think them foolish, which is a very foolish thing to think, or get annoyed with them." End quote. And then later, in chapter 12, as Bilbo ventures for the first time into the mountain, we get this famous critique of dwarven character. Quote, "The most that can be said for the dwarves is this. They intended to pay Bilbo really handsomely for his services. They had brought him to do a nasty job for them, and they did not mind the poor little fellow doing it if he would. But they would all have done their best to get him out of trouble if he got into it, as they did in the case of the trolls at the beginning of their adventures before they had any particular reasons for being grateful to him. There it is. Dwarves are not heroes, but calculating folk with a great idea of the value of money. Some are tricky and treacherous and pretty bad lots. Some are not, but are decent enough people like Thorin and company, if you don't expect too much." End quote. What's interesting here is that Tolkien clearly reconsiders this narrative perspective on dwarves arguably before the book even ends. It's tough to reconcile this brief description of dwarves en masse with the heroic end of Thorin Oakenshield and the real friendships which develop between Bilbo and the others. This is accompanied by external commentary and criticism of the dwarves, which I often think is overstated, but clearly has an influence over Tolkien. That is, the similarity between dwarves and the worst stereotypes of the Jewish people. This is compounded by Tolkien's conscious connection between the two. Khazad-dûm is intentionally patterned after Semitic languages, including Hebrew, and Tolkien sees the connection extending beyond language. In letter 176, sent in 1955 to Naomi Mitchison, he writes, quote, "I do think of the dwarves like Jews, at once native and alien in their habitations, speaking the languages of the country but with an accent due to their own private tongue." End quote. This has, of course, led to some accusations of anti-Semitism. I'll link in the show notes to the piece "Dwarves Are Not Heroes, Anti-Semitism and the Dwarves in J.R.R. Tolkien's Writing" by Rebecca Brackman, which is, I think, one of the best papers that I've ever read on the subject, but I consider, in general, those accusations to be largely baseless, though Tolkien at least was mindful of the speculation and sought to address it. So these forces, both internal and external, lead Professor Tolkien to properly address the dwarves, to develop their creation myth, to redress the balance a little bit when it comes to the Lord of the Rings, not just in the way that dwarven culture is presented, particularly in the Mines of Moria, but in the characterization of Gimli, who is, despite what the Jackson movie will tell you, one of the most dedicated, heroic, capable, and nuanced characters in the entire book. I could spend this entire opening segment and then another hour besides just talking about how great Gimli is and the character assassination he suffers at the hands of Jackson and Walsh and Boyens, and I will do that someday in the future. For now, I will settle for saying that the interactions between Gimli and the elves, Elrond and Legolas and most notably Galadriel, are, for me, among the most impressive in the entire book. Faithless is he that says farewell when the road darkens. Indeed. For all that, the dwarves receive much less attention through the span of Tolkien's life than the man or the elves of Middle-earth. We have no stories told from a dwarven perspective. The closest thing we get to a dwarven text is the Book of Mizarble, which the Fellowship recover from Moria, although its fate is unknown. We're told that Gimli ditches his gear at Parth Galen, and it's unclear whether the Book of Mizarble is included at that point. The dwarven language is structurally sound, but the vocabulary is terribly underdeveloped. We only get around 50 words of Khazad-dûm compared to over 2,000 words in Quenya, the original language of the elves. All of this means, as I said, that we're left with more questions than answers, but we have enough that we can sketch at least the history and the nature of the dwarven folk in Middle-earth. The dwarves, as we learn at the beginning of the Quenta Silmarillion, are created by Aule of the Valar, the demigod-like figure associated with crafting and smithing and the materials of the earth. He creates 7 dwarves from stone because he's impatient to meet the foretold children of Ilúvatar, the elves and the men. Ilúvatar, who is the godlike figure at the heart of Tolkien's legendarium, then comes to Aule and says, "Hey, nice mannequins, but you've noticed that they aren't alive. They can't move unless you move them. They don't have souls." And Aule realizes that he has gone too far. He moves to destroy them in a moment of humility. But in that moment, Ilúvatar grants the dwarves life and being and adopts them as the third of his children. He tells Aule that they will have to sleep until the elves have awoken out there in the world, and Aule obliges, placing these 7 dwarven forefathers deep beneath various mountains in Middle-earth. Then, after the elves wake at Cuivanen and are invited to join the Valar in the west and undertake a long and mostly incomplete journey, the dwarves wake and the great clans are founded. The Longbeards at Mount Gundabad, north of the Misty Mountains, the Firebeards and the Broadbeams in the Blue Mountains west of the Shire, and the Ironfoots, the Stiffbeards, the Blacklocks, and the Stonefoots out there in the east, members of which, it is said, fall under the shadow and the influence of Melkor and Sauron. It's the Longbeards, the line of Durin, which founds Khazad-dûm beneath the Misty Mountains, and it's from the line of Durin that most of our featured dwarves are descended. It's worth noting that all the dwarves, shortly after their awakening, are in contact with one another, all 7 clans, and we're told that they hold meetings and councils at the home of the Longbeards at Gundabad. This is presumably the point at which the petty dwarves also emerge, clanless dwarves who are exiled from the 7 great clans for committing various crimes. That is how we get to Mim, with whom we started this week's episode. The Firebeards and the Broadbeams, the dwarves of Nogrod and Belagost in the Blue Mountains west of the Shire, are heavily involved in the First Age history of Middle-earth. They are crafting weapons and jewelry of enormous importance, including the Nauglamir, the necklace that will eventually bear the Silmaril that Beren steals from Morgoth. This becomes the trigger point, the provocation for a war with the Sindar elves, which leads to the fall of Doriath and really sets up generations of enmity between the elves and the dwarves. Beneath the Misty Mountains, meanwhile, Khazad-dûm is prospering. The dwarves here have a good relationship with the elves of Eregion through the Second Age, enduring even after the forces of Sauron scatter what is left of the population of Eregion across the rest of Middle-earth. Khazad-dûm itself endures for around 6,000 years from its creation, through the end of the First Age, all of the Second Age, all the way to 1981 of the Third Age, crafting their mithril and mining deeper and deeper, until they awaken the slumbering Balrog, who slays King Durin VI and forces the dwarves out of Moria. Some flee north, going back toward Gundabad and the northern mountains, but some, under the leadership of King Thrain I, found Erebor, the kingdom under the Lonely Mountain. Their skilled miners discover there the Arkenstone. But following the death of Thrain I, his son Thorin I, not that Thorin, but an ancestor of that Thorin, leads the dwarves away from Erebor to the larger, richer mountains of the north. 400 years pass until the dragons gain power in the north and the dwarves flee back to Erebor, founding a new and improved kingdom under the mountain, secure forever against the threat of dragons. Secure at least for around 200 years, because in 2770 of the Third Age, Smaug, the greatest fire-breathing dragon in the world, descends upon Erebor, claims the treasure, and drives the dwarves out. A century passes before Gandalf, visiting the hold of the necromancer in Dol Guldur, finds an aged dwarf who no longer remembers his own name. That dwarf gives to Gandalf a key and a map, which Gandalf keeps for the better part of a century until he, by chance, meets Thorin Oakenshield, heir to the kingdom of Erebor in Bree, east of the Shire. This, of course, leads directly to the quest of Erebor, as told by Bilbo Baggins in The Hobbit, and the recovery of Erebor and the Arkenstone for the dwarves. And through all of this, and the events that follow thereafter, I think we get a sense of what it is that makes the dwarves of Tolkien's legendarium so special, so enchanting for the reader. They're given such strong characterization, such a sense of identity that has little to do with the rest of Middle-earth. They are defiantly independent. And if, as a consequence of that independence, we have less access to their internal culture, to their history, to their own sense of themselves, well, that just makes them all the more interesting. And so, let's leave dwarves behind, if only for a short time, and answer a listener question. This week I am indebted to Terry for sending a question that somehow I have never really considered before. This is a fun one. Quote, Faramir has been my favorite character ever since I first read The Lord of the Rings in the 90s, and I know that he's one of your favorites too, so I wanted to ask what you think would have happened if Faramir had obeyed the prophetic dream about Rivendell instead of passing it to Boromir. Would he have been more successful? Would he have prevented Merry and Pippin from being kidnapped at Amon Hen? End quote. Terry, thank you so much. This is obviously going to be a little bit speculative, right? But it is such an interesting proposition because, yes, Boromir seems clear in the account that he gives at the Council of Elrond that back in June of 3018, the night before Ithilien is attacked, Faramir is the first one to dream of the riddle. Seek for the sword that was broken, in Imladris it dwells. There shall be counsels taken, stronger than Morgul's spells. Faramir, we're told, had the dream often. Boromir claims that he also had the dream himself, though I know that there are some readers out there who question his honesty here and wonder if he's claiming to have had the dream so that he can go on the quest for Imladris, for Rivendell, instead of his younger brother. But let's suppose that Faramir is the intended recipient. Let me pause, actually, just to acknowledge first that in the earlier versions of this story, the dream was had by Denethor himself and by people all over Minas Tirith. It was just a dream that was passed to the Gondorians rather than to specific individuals, which I can't help but feel is almost more evocative, is almost more powerful, though it also demands a greater scrutiny be placed on where the prophecy comes from. It makes it more undeniable, even for the characters in the story. In any case, let's suppose that Faramir was the intended recipient and that he wound up at the Council of Elrond just as Boromir did. And let's suppose further that he also ends up joining the Fellowship like his big brother did, though I do wonder if there's an argument to be made that Faramir, maybe less concerned with heroism, might return to his duty having attended the council, because there's a 2-month gap, remember, between the Council of Elrond and the Fellowship setting up. But then I also wonder if Faramir would have been more immediately accepting of Aragorn's identity, and thus would have seen his duty to be to remain at Rivendell with his king. We're speculating, and since we're speculating, let's get to the heart of it, because we're really thinking about the temptation of the ring. We're thinking about Boromir's failure to resist it, even momentarily. And I'll say that it does seem likely to me that Faramir would resist the ring more effectively at Amon Hen, just as he resists it later in Ithilien, because he isn't driven by that same desire for glory, that same sense of the majesty of Gondor. We can't be completely certain that Faramir wouldn't succumb, but it seems pretty likely to me. So from the council, we would leave Rivendell, we would plunge into Moria, we would see Gandalf fall, presumably, assuming that we don't write some creative fanfic about Faramir slaying the Balrog and saving Gandalf's life. And then, well, things probably would be a little different in Lothlorien, assuming that Faramir is resisting the ring, because there wouldn't be the same suspicion that we see with Boromir, but I don't know that that really changes anything material. And it still isn't clear what would happen when we make it down the Anduin to Amon Hen. Without Boromir providing a very sharp, inciting incident, it doesn't seem likely that Frodo would decide to go off on his own. I know that he's already thinking of that as we approach Parthgallen and Amon Hen, but Boromir seems to be the trigger for that action. So if he doesn't go off, if he doesn't avoid the orc attack, if the Fellowship stays more or less together, is it possible that Frodo would be captured by the orcs along with Merry and Pippin, or that he would be left behind with Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas, along with Sam, of course? We're assuming here that Faramir would fall as Boromir did, trying to do a 1-to-1 replacement here. Maybe we shouldn't, and maybe things would go even more wildly aside. But the possibility of the hobbits being taken opens some speculation about the danger of the ring winding up in Fangorn, or in Isengard, or in Edoras. Would it tempt Treebeard? Would it call out to Orthanc? Would it tempt Theoden, still under the influence of Wormtongue and Saruman, assuming that we make it back to Edoras in the first place? And even if it doesn't, all roads from Parthgallen, except Frodo's, lead to Minas Tirith and the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. If Frodo doesn't leave from Parthgallen, it is hard to imagine how he could possibly get through to Mordor. Instead of taking his own path, accompanied by Sam and Gollum, he'd inevitably be confronted by the great and the powerful, all of whom might give in to the seductive whisper of the ring. My best guess is that the Fellowship would stay unified at Parthgallen. It would defeat the orcs. Faramir would probably fall for the symmetry of the thing, and then the Fellowship as a whole would continue south, straight to Gondor. And once there, I don't know if Denethor acknowledges Aragorn as king, if Boromir, captain of the guard, tries to take the ring. I don't know if Frodo and Sam try to leave in the middle of the night and try to cross into Osgiliath and into Ithilien. They probably wouldn't know not to try the Black Gate, because Gollum wouldn't have told them about Cirith Ungol, and although they might get better advice and planning in Minas Tirith than they would get from Cirith Ungol, although it's difficult to be sure how much access to information they would have. Even if they do leave on their own and try to get to Mordor unseen, what happens behind them? Gondor falls without the Rohirrim and the dead man of Dunharrow. There isn't then an army of the West to distract Sauron at the Black Gate, and we still have the presence of Saruman and the orc pits of Isengard to the west. Theoden is still under his shadow. And then there's the specter of Frodo meeting the Rangers of Ithilien under a different command, someone less wise than Faramir, in more desperate circumstances, with the shadow all the more powerful and immediate, and that confrontation probably would not work out as well. It's hard to see a clear path for Frodo and Sam and the Ring all the way to Mount Doom. And that's the thing about eucatastrophe. Even evil gets turned, ultimately, in crisis, to good. Faramir may not have failed as his brother did, or fallen as his brother did, but from that moment of catastrophe, we see the threads of hope, of restoration to Theoden and the Riders of the Mark, the destruction of Isengard, the casting down of Saruman, the hope against hope at the Pelennor Fields, and even the turning of Gollum when Frodo's strength fails him. As Tolkien writes in Leaf by Niggle, things might have been different, but they could not have been better. Faramir is exactly where he needs to be to help Frodo in his quest. And then he's exactly where he needs to be in the Houses of Healing to guide Éowyn to a better, happier, healthier, more complete life. And Boromir, well, Boromir's maybe exactly where he needs to be, too. Thank you for that question, Terry. That one was a lot of fun. Last week, I asked what turned out to be a challenging question with a very limited number of answers, because I was curious who you, the Shire Reckoning faithful, would recast from the Peter Jackson Fellowship if you absolutely had to. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the responses fell into exactly 3 categories. Nobody, which feels like it maybe wouldn't satisfy the malicious genie responsible for this question. Billy Boyd received a couple of nominations, possibly because I put my finger on the scale and suggested that James McAvoy might be a good replacement. But fully half of the responses that I got back suggested that Legolas Greenleaf might be at least as good if he were performed by someone other than Orlando Bloom, which, I mean, I get it. I could have predicted this response before I even asked the question, but I will say for the record that I don't think that Bloom is bad. I don't think that Bloom is solely responsible for the problems with Legolas, such as they are in the Rings trilogy. He is a little underdeveloped, even in the original text, and the adaptation doesn't do much to fill in the blanks there, to give Legolas as much development as Elrond or Galadriel. But I suppose I am forced reluctantly to concede that if Bloom does what he is asked to do in the films, he doesn't over-deliver. He doesn't take it further than is on the page. And it's tough because this is inarguably one of the finest ensemble casts ever assembled, and someone has to be the least impressive. At the same time, the only person brave enough to offer an alternative piece of casting was Sarah, who suggested Heath Ledger, which, I mean, is just a very, very strong choice, and would at least be more unexpected in the role. Thanks to everyone who got in touch with their answers. I have another question for you this week, as I will have every week. This week, picking up from that discussion of the dwarves, I have another movie question, but a more positive one. Which of Thorin's company delivers the best performance across the entire Hobbit trilogy? I think there are possibly as many as 5 really legitimate answers, and cases could be made for more than that, but I want to know who you think. We've got Richard Armitage as Thorin Oakenshield, Ken Stott as Balin, Aidan Turner as Keely, Dino Gorman as Feely, Mark Hadlow as Dory, Jed Brophy as Nori, Adam Brown as Ori, John Callan as Owen, Peter Hambleton as Glowin, William Kircher as Biffer, James Nesbitt as Boffer, and Stephen Hunter as Bomber. Get in touch via social media and let me know your answer. Shire Reckoning Pod on Instagram and Blue Sky. Comment on the YouTube video. Email me directly at shirereckoningpod@gmail.com, or just gaze into your Palantir until my face appears. What a terrible thing that would be. On Tuesday evening, I hope that you will be able to join me for our live discussion of Chapter 3 of The Hobbit over on YouTube. This week, we're talking primarily about the elves and their representation, as well as the mechanics of moonletters and prophecy as we finally make it to Rivendell. Stay tuned to youtube.com/@ShireReckoningPod. And please, if you enjoy the work that I'm doing here on Shire Reckoning, if you would like to join our fellowship and offer your support, check out patreon.com/nextword, where you can pledge that support and get access to the live after show for our Tuesday night book discussions, Last Call at the Green Dragon. That is turning into so much fun. I had an absolute blast last Tuesday night, just kind of exploring questions of morality and ethics in Tolkien's Legendarium. It was a really good show. I think I'm going to release a little clip of that in the podcast feed over the next few days, just so you can get a sense of how things work behind the velvet rope there. Last Call at the Green Dragon. You can find out more patreon.com/nextword. And so, because that first segment ran a little long, let's get into our almanac. Today, as of this recording, is the birthday of Evangeline Lilly, who made such a strong impression as Kate in the TV show Lost, is the canonical Wasp in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and played the character Tauriel in the Hobbit trilogy, a very controversial role because the internet is the absolute worst. August 4th is the 111st birthday of Allen and Unwin's London office, Tolkien's publisher, from which the publication of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings was managed. And on August 6th, 2002, The Fellowship of the Ring was first released on DVD and, believe it or not, VHS. It was a gigantic success. It moved 12 million copies in the US alone, and we should spare a thought for those 12 million people who wouldn't see the extended edition until November, a month before the theatrical release of The Two Towers. What a time to be alive. And lastly, August 9th will be the 52nd anniversary of the last known photograph of the professor, taken in front of his favourite tree in the Botanical Garden in Oxford. The link to that photograph, as well as everything else that I'm mentioning, is in the show notes. In Arda, it'll be another quiet week, but there is one notable event, because on August 7th, 1319 of the Third Age, King Theoden's funereal procession will finally arrive at Edoras. His funeral will happen on the 10th, but that's a story for next week's show. The biggest Tolkien news this week has been undoubtedly the, let's say, mixed response to the release of Tales of the Shire, a The Lord of the Rings game, the first real video game produced in-house at Weta Workshop, the visual effects studio in New Zealand which worked so closely with Jackson for the movies. Tales of the Shire, as the name suggests, is a cozy little life simulator game set in Bywater, in which players can create their own individual hobbits and forage and fish and cook and decorate their homes and generally live happy, idyllic little lives in the Shire. The response has been all over the place. The IGN review gave the game a 4 out of 10, and the Metacritic score is currently sitting at a 58 out of 100, but the Steam reviews for the PC version are generally positive, with the Nintendo Switch version attracting the worst of the criticism. I have not played this game myself. I am not going to have time for a little while, but when the darker days of winter arrive, and the game has hopefully seen a few updates, I'm certain that I will pick it up, and I will let you know what I think. On a related note, Polygon published a piece this week by Claire Lewis entitled "It's Been a Rough Decade for Lord of the Rings Games." The link to that is in the show notes. The Thoughts on Tolkien blog has a great post this week, glossing the scholarship on a brief note written by the professor using ancient Greek terms. And forgive my ancient Greek here, but I believe Hippolytians and Anaxapians to describe Rohan and the Rohirrim. It is such a long way from my own areas of interest and expertise, but that is one of the things that makes Tolkien fandom so fun. Two other quick things just before we wrap up. The Tolkien Society this week wrote to the Bank of England suggesting Tolkien as a possible candidate for a future British banknote. The professor would join Shakespeare and Dickens and Jane Austen as writers who have previously or currently graced British currency. I might suggest that Professor Tolkien replace Turner on the £20 note because, Turner, right? You've seen one Turner, you've seen them all. And lastly, Amazon has announced that production has begun on the third season of The Rings of Power, which means that we are looking at a late 2026 release date, which gives me a whole year to watch the 16 episodes currently available. I will get right on that. And that is going to do it for this week's episode of Shire Reckoning. Join me on Tuesday for Chapter 3 of The Hobbit. Follow at Shire Reckoning Pod on Instagram and Blue Sky. Check the show notes for links to everything that I've talked about. Email me all your questions and comments at shirereckoningpod@gmail.com. And help support independent, ad-free, geeky podcasting by visiting patreon.com/nextword. Thank you all so much for listening. I will talk to you all again next week. Take care.